So we can move now to the third speaker of this session. So Anne Bezuidenhout from the University of South Carolina. She's going to give a presentation on appositives from the perspective of relevance theory. So if Daniel, you can stop sharing the screen so that Anne can display her presentation, and then we can start. Thanks. We can see the PowerPoint, Anne.
Okay, very good. So I'll get started then. Whoops. So just what this talk is going to be about, I'm going to make a few comments just about appositives or not, and the at issue versus not at issue debate, then describe some experimental work that I've done with my colleagues, and some reflections on what this will tell us about the discourse role of these types of parentheticals, and then quickly describe some new experiments that we've done, and then talk about how RT might help. So I'm sure that everybody knows, but just so we're on the same page, appositives is used to refer to both the positive relative clauses. So an example might be Jack, who is a cat, loves his tail, and nominal positives, Jack, a cat, loves his tail. And many have argued that the contents of appositives are not at issue. So in the update semantics, for instance, proposed by Murray, the contents of appositives are added to the common ground automatically, and unlike assertions and questions, they're not considered as proposals to modify common ground. And a similar view has been suggested by others who like this distinction. So Murray, for instance, argues that the role of appositives is a supporting one, for instance, to satisfy the presuppositions of the main clause or to block unwanted inferences. So in TV, a cat likes to chase her tail. The noun phrase appositive there is supposed to be blocking an unwanted inference that TV is a dog, and also satisfying the presupposition that TV is a thing that has a tail. Potts has had a similar kind of view about appositives, their role. They're excellent vehicles for side remarks, he says, and he also thinks that one of their main roles is to satisfy the presuppositions of expressions in the main clause. I won't necessarily pause on that example. So we've looked at this, we've entered this debate trying to look at it experimentally and to see whether indeed it is the case that, and we're focusing on positive relative clauses, which from now on I will call arcs. We've been looking at arcs to see whether indeed they are not at issue or have the properties of being not at issue. So we've been looking, our earliest work was looking at unembedded sentences with a main clause and an arc. And what we did was vary whether the arc was sentence medial or sentence final, and whether the arc expressed an event or a state. So for instance, the two medial conditions might be my friend Sophie, who's a classical violinist, played a piece by Mozart, versus my friend Sophie, who played a piece by Mozart as a classical violinist. The italicized phrases are supposed to, the first one is a stative and the second one is eventive. Those are both medial. Here's just what in our experiments, what a screen that the participants would have seen. They were given instructions that they would see a little dialogue between two speakers. And what the task was to decide when speaker B objects to what speaker A says by saying, no, that's not true. They had to decide which of the options was the target of denial. And one of them, of course, was the main clause. The other was the arc. And then we also had an option that there wasn't enough information. This is a version of what's been called the direct denial test. And the intuition would be from these people like Potts and Murray that arcs are not good targets for denials, that when speaker B is, when speaker A thinks about what's being denied, they will think it's the main clause that's being denied. Subsequently, we focused on just eventive arcs and distinguished between what we call continuative and relevance arcs, which is terminology taken from Rudy Luke. So here would be an example. The lawyer handed a brief to the clerk, who then rushed to get it to court. That would be a continuative arc because it moves the narrative sequence forward. And Huddleston and Pillham in their grammar of English have noted that there is this category. In fact, it's an old distinction, but relevance in arcs, on the other hand, like a lawyer handed a brief to the clerk who had been pacing outside. There, we're just providing background information, not moving the narrative sequence forward. Once again, we use the direct denial test. So this is something that the participants might have seen, the dialogue between speaker A and speaker B being saying, no, that's not true. And then what is speaker B trying to deny? And that this time we only had two options, the main clause or the arc. So this is sort of what the kind of structure we're imagining that people have to construct. In the continuative case, you're supposed to see that there's a sequence of a narrative sequence that the arc contributes to, whereas in the case of the relevance arc, it's just simply providing you some background information. And so what have we found? We've consistently found that eventive arcs in the sentence medial position, in the sentence final position, are more likely to be regarded as targets of denial than sentence medial or stative arcs. We didn't find any significant interaction effects, so we assume that these are two different underlying mechanisms driving these effects, the effect of sentence position and one that about eventiveness. So, for example, there's plenty of evidence that sentence processing shows recency effects, where material that's in recent working memory has advantages over earlier processed material. So it could just be that sentence final asks are more salient in working memory and promoted as potential denial targets. I'll say a bit more about that below. As to the effect of eventiveness, this is what we were hoping to explore in that the experiments I already mentioned about the continuative versus relevance, because our intuitions were perhaps that this is being driven by the fact that continuative arcs in particular are at issue because they are part of the narrative sequence. And here we have indeed found that continuative arcs are judged to be the targets of denial more frequently than relevance arcs, although this result tends not to be as robust. So we often, for instance, find that the difference is statistically significant just in the subject's analysis or something like that, and it doesn't turn out to be quite as robust. We've also used another kind of test that was devised by Syret and Koev, and maybe just to show you this example, to see what this test is supposed to be. So speaker A says, Jasmine emailed a reminder note which got sent to spam to her boyfriend, and speaker B says, why? And the task for the participants is to say which answer is more likely to be addressing the question that speaker B was asking, because the boyfriend was forgetful, which obviously, which is an explanation for the main clause, because she added heart emojis to her subject line. That's an explanation for why the email got sent to spam. And what we found is that obviously main clauses are, as in all these experiments I've mentioned so far, tend to be selected as antecedents for elliptical questions marginally more frequently. However, sentence position, which was the main thing we're manipulating here, whether the arc was sentence medial or sentence final, had no significant effect. Medial arcs were selected as antecedents as frequently as final ones. So the takeaway here is that recency of mention, if there is an effect for this, can be overridden as a factor in some cases. So the two tests that we've used, this direct denial test and the elliptical Y test, both involve discourse anaphora. The anaphora is resolved by interpreting it as having the same content as the content of an antecedent clause. And like pronominal anaphora, it is a device for establishing coherence. In the discourse anaphora case, the issue has to do with what would make a coherent next turn in a discourse, rather than what co-reference relations hold. Nevertheless, I think we've tended to think that one way of construing our main experimental question is asking which discourse units are potentially available as sites for discourse continuations. And is it only ones contributed by main clauses, or can discourse units contributed by arcs also under certain conditions be such sites for continuation? And our results seem to show that arc contents can be the discourse units that are picked up in discourse continuations. So we can therefore say that arcs are at least in some sense to be construed as at issue, especially if we define at-issueness in the way that Koev has. He distinguishes many different notions of at-issueness, but one of them is coherence at-issueness. And it seems clear that arcs are coherent at issue, or can be coherence at issue. So interim conclusions that I want to just highlight: eventiveness and sentence final position play a role in bringing an arc content to the foreground, making such contents possible targets for both denials and challenges, or denials and challenges. The distinction between continuative and relevance arcs that we have found, that we've been exploring, we think is an important and understudied element of the experimental work. So these are these arcs that move the narrative forward. They need to be explored in more depth. And the other important thing is that there's these two tests that we've used, the direct denial and the elliptical Y, show that there's a difference between challenging a previous speaker's assertion, that's not so, and asking for an elaboration by asking why, because arc contents seem to be apt targets for why questions, even when they're in sentence medial position. So once again, just to say, we then think that arcs are coherence at issue. They contribute discourse units that are sites for possible discourse continuations. All these experiments I've described very hastily have been, because we used these two tests, were constructed as dialogues between two speakers, either for one speaker objecting to what another has said or asking what another has said. So Justin Koo at MIT suggested that we do a different kind of test, which was to see whether to present arcs under the scope of various operators and have participants judge whether or not they project. And we chose to test embeddings under questions and under if. So here is just very briefly our experimental design. We designed test items which were presented as an utterance made by a hypothetical speaker, Mary. And the utterance was either a declarative or a question. And the arcs were either continuative or relevance. So we have 4 conditions, and here would be the 4 conditions. So the nurse paged the emergency room doctor, who then rushed to tend the patient. Did the nurse page the emergency room doctor, who then rushed to tend the patient, versus the nurse paged the emergency room doctor, who's a cardiac specialist? Did the nurse page blah, blah, blah? And for each item, participants were presented with choices and asked to say which, if any, they thought Mary herself was assuming to be true. And so the choices consisted of either the main clause, the arc, or an option that said none of the above. And importantly, we'd programmed it so that multiple choices were allowed, meaning in effect that there were 4 possible judgments that people were making, either the main clause, the arc, neither, or both. And then for embedding under if, the structure was pretty much the same. Test items were presented as an utterance made by a hypothetical speaker, Mary. And the utterance was a conditional whose antecedent contained an arc, and arcs were either continuative or relevance. Thus, every item had 2 conditions. If Peter gave his suit to the tailor, who then adjusted it to the correct fit, the suit will be perfect. Versus if Peter gave the suit to the tailor, who had a reputation for doing good work, the suit would be perfect. Again, each item was presented with these choices, the same as before, where you've got to say which one Mary herself assumes to be true. And there, ultimately, we can take out of people's answers whether they think it's the main clause, the arc, neither, or both. And of course, this, I don't want to spend time on describing all the things we did to make sure that there was well constructed experiment, but here are some sample screens that people would have seen in answering these questions. So the one in blue, this would be the question condition with the continuative arc. So did the lawyer hand an important brief to the judicial clerk, who then hurried the brief to court? Which of the following does Mary herself assume? Select all you think apply. The lawyer handed an important brief to the judicial clerk. The judicial clerk hurried the brief to court. None of the above. And of course, people had the option to pick both 1 and 2. And by the way, these were randomly, the first 2 options were random. And then the red one is the one with the if experiment. So if the journalist interviewed the witness who has been under police protection, there will be a good story. Which of the following do you think Mary assumes to be true? The journalist interviewed the witness has been under police protection, none of the above. And this is the condition where we have a relevance arc as opposed to a continuative arc. And what we predicted was that compared to relevance arcs, continuative arcs would more frequently be treated as under the scope of the question or the conditional. So in the question assertion experiment, the assertion conditions were acting basically as controls because participants should select both in those conditions, whether the arc is continuative or not. So in other words, they should have said both, they should have clicked on both because that represents the judgment that both the main clause and the arc are commitments of Mary's. On the other hand, when the arc is under the scope of a question or embedded in the antecedent of a conditional, they ought to select neither when the arc is continuative and select the arc option when the embedded arc is a relevance arc. And here is the results. So look at the right-hand side, I'm sorry, the left-hand side first, that's the declaratives, which are sort of acting as a control. As you see, people overwhelmingly, well, I don't know if you think it's overwhelming, but they certainly, they selected both, which is what they should be doing. If you're saying if Mary's making an assertion, she should be committed to all parts of her assertion. Looking on the right, which is the embedding under the questions, you can see that relevance arcs are commitments judged to be commitments of Mary's fairly frequently. And actually, disappointingly, maybe continuative arcs also get some boost over here, but look at also the neither option, that goes up considerably, and compared to the relevance condition, it's significantly greater. So this does seem to show that people did make the judgment that when under the scope of an when under the scope of the question, the continuative arc does not project. And then for the embedding under if, we get pretty nice similar results. When the arc is relevance, people choose it more frequently as the commitment of Mary's. Whereas if it's a continuative arc, they are more likely to say that neither projects, and both the main clause and the continuative arc are under the scope of the conditional. Sorry, I can't see anybody. How much time do I have left?
So the time is actually almost over.
Okay.
Yeah, it's over.
Okay. So just mention this question under discussion test. It's another test that people have proposed. So allegedly, arcs can't address a question under the question under discussion. So when you say, what sort of cancer does Jack have? And you answer, Jack, who has liver cancer, is currently hospitalized. That apparently is degraded. You should answer the question that's under the question in the main clause, and the arc should be backgrounded. Of course, there are cases that seem to be counterexamples. Who's coming to dinner tonight? Well, I haven't talked to Charles, who probably won't be able to come, but I did talk to Sally, who is coming. This seems to be a counterexample, but the people who like the CUD framework have, like Mandy Simons and et al. Have said, no, this is not a counterexample, because this is a case where the arc is addressing a question under discussion. It's not a case of an arc addressing a question under discussion, because the question under discussion has actually changed. Rather, the hero is able to reconstruct a new question under discussion, which is probably something like, who have I checked with about their intentions to come for dinner? Then there's a final example, and this is where maybe relevance could come in. Consider examples like this. I heard Jack was diagnosed with cancer. What sort of cancer does he have? And speaker B says, Jack, who has pancreatic cancer, is right now in a terminal coma. and another example, look at that strange man wearing a diaper. How old is he? Speaker B says, that man who's 60 years old is my father. These are cases where the question under discussion has been answered by the ARC, but perhaps because the answer is deemed less conversationally relevant than the information that's contained in the main clause. So it's not a case where you've reconstructed the question under discussion, but you've somehow demoted that question as somehow being tasteless, tactless, not worth pursuing, or something like that. And I think this is where something like relevance theory could help us. So in addition to this line of trying to use relevance theory to explain how those might be felicitous examples, I also hope to just generally use work by Diane Blakemore on and parentheticals to use a relevance theory explanation for explaining why, this is especially crucial in the case of the continuative arcs, why you would use the construction that has a continuative arc as opposed to using just two independent sentences. And this is a similar question that Diane has raised with respect to and parentheticals. So I feel like there's an explanation there too for how we might bring in relevance theory to this field. All right, thank you very much. I guess I'll stop sharing and be able to see the screen again. We'll be seeing people again, I should say.
Thank you very much. Daniel, please.
Thanks. I didn't want to jump in again because I'm sure you're sick of hearing my voice. But you opened so many wonderful, interesting topics that I think I just have to focus on one small thing. When you talk about the two different tests in the first part of your presentation of at-issueness, and you talk about the difference between the denial and the why test, perhaps you could elaborate on why you think there are such differences between those two tests of at-issueness.
That's a good question, and I mean, I don't think I have any developed answer about it. So intuitively, what the denial test is doing is trying to, well, you're challenging another speaker's contribution with potentially trying to remove that from the common ground, or say that it shouldn't be added to the common ground. Whereas when you're asking for, when you're asking why, you're not trying to remove something, but you're just trying to have more information be given to you about something. And it seems like there could be, well, you have a very definite target. Well, I mean, so, right. That's true. Why would one think, why would you care? Why does the medial thing get an advantage with the questions, but not with the challenges? Of course, as everybody knows, you can challenge something in medial position. I mean, so the traditional story goes something like this: when you have an arc in medial position, well, actually in any position, denial would normally target the main clause, but you can always, as the phrase goes, bring conversational proceedings to a halt and say, "Hey, wait a minute." But, you know, and then challenge the thing that is allegedly in the background. And according to this way that this framework that we're challenging, arcs are always in the background. So the only way to challenge them would be to bring conversational proceedings to a halt and say, hey, wait a minute. But it seems like they can actually be direct denial targets. But yes, it is interesting that we haven't found that medial ones are such good targets for denials. Eventiveness, and sentence final position seem to be really important for the denial, whereas sentence position seems to play no role. And I don't really, other than that, these are two different kind of conversational moves. So why assume that things are the same? If they're two different moves, it potentially things could be different. I mean, I think that there's always uniformity depending on the kind of conversational move you're making. But I agree, I would need a much more systematic story to explain, other than just make this observation that these two moves do have these different properties.
Fascinating data. Thank you very much. I'm kind of reminded of the information structure literature where there's different question tests which are used for questioning the status, but the question tests themselves have an impact on how the interpretation. So it's sort of the same thing is happening here. What is at issue? Well, it depends on the question you're using to test what is at issue in the first place, right? It's kind of changes. It's not neutral to the material that you're experimentally trying to test. And fascinating stuff. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that question. I mean, I've known that I should be thinking about that in more detail for a long time, but I just, need to have a better story next time somebody asks.
Okay, so if there are no further questions, we can thank Anne again, and we'll reconvene in 15 minutes with the last plenary talk of the day.